there was this house near where I lived, an eerie, incomplete structure that had been left to rot for years. Locals called it the ghost house because the construction had stopped halfway through, leaving a decaying skeleton of what was meant to be a 2-story home. Its hulking frame sat on a block that already gave off bad vibes. Many of the houses nearby looked abandoned, with overgrown grass, broken windows, and neglected yards. Some had cars parked in the driveways, but whether those homes were truly occupied was anyone's guess. My friends Jenny, Luca, Kylie, and I had always been curious about that place. One late night, we were bored, driving around with fast food in hand, when Luca suggested something that had come up before, but was always dismissed as a joke. "Why don't we go inside the ghost house?" For a second, nobody said anything. Then Kylie, ever the thrill-seeker, smirked. "I'm in." That's all it took. Jenny and I exchanged glances, knowing we were in for something stupid, but irresistible nonetheless. We parked a few houses down, not wanting to attract attention, though that seemed unlikely given how dark and lifeless the block was. The only light came from a single street lamp flickering down the road. The rest of the street was shrouded in darkness, and many of the neighboring homes were blacked out, adding to the unsettling quiet that hung over the area. As we approached the ghost house, its hulking, unfinished frame seemed more sinister under the moonlight. The front door was locked, but Luca, always the determined one, led us around the house, trying windows until we found one that slid open with a groan. Jenny, being the smallest, squeezed through the window and unlocked the back door for the rest of us. But when we reached the door, she said something strange. It had already been unlocked when she got there. We entered cautiously, greeted by the musty, putrid smell of decay and damp wood, mixed with something worse, like old cat urine that had fermented in the walls. The first floor was more intact than I had expected. Large, empty rooms, bare walls, no furniture, just the shell of what could have been a home. We split up to explore. I went upstairs, the creaky steps groaning under my weight, while the others poked around the first floor. The second story was unfinished, with exposed wall frames and insulation sticking out in patches. The quiet was unsettling. The only sounds were my footsteps and the faint, muffled voices of my friends below. But something about the acoustics made their voices sound off, as if they were coming from different parts of the house at once. When I couldn't find much of interest upstairs, I headed back down and ran into Jenny, who asked what I'd seen. "Nothing but unfinished rooms," I replied, but she seemed intrigued and went up to check for herself. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started looking for the basement. I found it behind a heavy brown door under the stairs. The smell intensified as soon as I opened it. An overwhelming stench of mold, rot, and that cat urine scent, but sharper now, almost burning my nose. The stairs leading down were old, wooden, and narrow, and I had to be careful as I descended. The basement was darker, with only a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting weak shadows on the walls. The basement was more decrepit than the rest of the house. The concrete floor was stained with rusty-looking smears, and in one corner was a small wooden chair with a Bible sitting on a rickety little table. The sight of the Bible was unnerving. It was out of place, as if someone had been using the basement as a makeshift chapel. I heard footsteps above me, assuming it was one of the others, and called out, "Hey, come check this out!" But no one answered. I turned toward the stairs, expecting to see Jenny or Kylie, but instead I saw something else. In the far corner of the room, half hidden in shadow, was a woman. Her long, matted hair covered most of her face, but her eyes, wide, empty, and staring, were locked onto mine. She didn't move. She just sat there, hunched against the wall, watching. Suddenly, A scream echoed from upstairs, followed by Luca's frantic voice yelling, "Get out! Now!" My body moved before my mind could react. I ran up the stairs, bursting through the basement door and into the hallway where my friends were already fleeing toward the back door. I didn't look back, didn't stop to catch my breath until we were back in the car, the engine roaring as we sped away. Breathless and trembling, I asked what they had seen. Overlapping voices shouted explanations, but it was Kylie who finally made sense of it. They had walked into one of the rooms and seen two men standing in the shadows, staring at them. They hadn't seen their faces, just their tall, looming figures. They'd also noticed strange, dark objects on the floor, but there hadn't been time to see what they were. As for me, I could only think about that woman in the basement, her eyes, the eerie stillness in her gaze. We had no idea who she was, or if she had ever really been there. My friend Chaz and I were always troublemakers, especially during those long, boring summer nights. We lived in a quiet, suburban town that was too peaceful for its own good, with big houses and rows of perfectly manicured lawns. But there was one place in our town that stood out, a massive, crumbling mansion that sat at the top of a hill, right at the edge of a cemetery. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, and the mansion had become our go-to spot for causing mischief when we were bored. The place was a mess. Graffiti covered every wall, windows were shattered, and the roof was falling apart. But for Chaz and me, it was perfect. We'd go there to drink, smoke, and just hang out, knowing that no one would bother us. It was a creepy place, especially at night, but we didn't care. The more unsettling it was, the more it excited us. One night, after getting stood up by a couple of girls, Chaz and I decided to blow off some steam by throwing rocks at the mansion's windows. It was 3 a.m., the perfect time to do something stupid. We didn't bother driving, we were a little drunk, and the walk up the hill wasn't far. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that makes everything feel heavy. By the time we reached the mansion, we were sweating, but ready to have some fun. The mansion looked even more sinister under the moonlight. Its twisted vines snaked across the crumbling brick walls, and the broken windows seemed to glare at us, daring us to get closer. Without saying a word, Chaz picked up a rock and hurled it at one of the fourth-floor windows. The shattering sound was almost deafening in the silence of the night. Laughing, I picked up my own rock and threw it at a second-floor window. Smash! It was oddly satisfying. There was one tiny window at the top of the mansion, probably part of the attic. Chaz challenged me to hit it, but after missing several times, I gave up. Grinning, Chaz took his turn. With a practiced flick of his wrist, he launched a rock straight at the attic window. It hit dead on, shattering the glass with a sharp crack. Before I could congratulate him, something strange happened. Out of the shattered attic window, something flew. It sailed through the air, landing at our feet with a soft thud. We looked down, and there it was, the same rock Chaz had just thrown, now lying at our feet. There was no mistaking it. It had a unique imprint, a Z-shaped scar on its surface that made it stand out. We stared at the rock in stunned silence, unsure of what we had just witnessed. After a few seconds, Chaz spoke, his voice low and unsteady. "There's someone in there." We figured it had to be a group of kids, probably messing with us. That idea gave us a surge of adrenaline. We decided to sneak into the mansion and catch them by surprise. The front door, as always, was ajar, barely hanging on its hinges. We slipped inside, the heavy smell of mildew and rotting wood hitting us immediately. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the broken windows. We moved slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible, but the creaking floorboards gave us away with every step. We made our way upstairs, the air growing colder as we ascended. The upper floors had always been the creepiest, more decayed, more claustrophobic. As we reached the third floor, we heard something, a soft, scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. We froze, listening. The sound came from above us, from the attic. Without thinking, we headed up, our footsteps echoing through the narrow stairwell. The door to the attic was closed, but light seeped through the cracks. Chaz reached for the handle, and as he pushed the door open, it creaked loudly, revealing the attic in all its decayed glory. It was mostly empty, except for a few dusty boxes and broken furniture. But in the corner, hunched over in the shadows, was a figure, a man. He was wearing an old, tattered suit, the kind you'd see in old photos from the 1920s. His back was to us, and he was rocking back and forth slowly, almost rhythmically. We stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, slowly, the man stopped rocking. His movements ceased entirely, like a puppet whose strings had just been cut. Without turning around, he spoke, his voice raspy and hollow. "Why have you come?" Chaz bolted down the stairs without another word, and I was right behind him. We didn't stop running until we were far away from that cursed mansion, the cemetery gates long behind us. Whatever we had just seen, whatever had spoken to us, wasn't human, and I have no intention of ever going back. We were crouched low behind a pair of gravestones, trying to catch our breath, and for a moment the entire scene felt unreal. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, but the eerie quiet of the cemetery felt like a strange relief after what we had just gone through. I kept my eyes locked on the mansion, heart pounding, watching the cloaked figures move with disturbing precision, their silhouettes barely visible against the dark night sky. "What the hell was that?" I whispered to Chaz, who was still grinning like this was some twisted prank. "I have no idea, but that was insane," he whispered back, his voice still filled with a mix of excitement and disbelief. I, on the other hand, wasn't laughing. My mind kept replaying the moment when I looked down the staircase and saw those cloaked figures staring right back at me. How long had they been there? Were they following us the entire time, just waiting for the right moment? The questions were piling up, but there were no answers, just the quiet night and the cold ground pressing against my back as I tried to slow my breathing. The cloaked figures continued circling the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They were thorough, checking every bush, every corner, as if they were hunting for something, or someone. I could feel my skin crawl with unease. "Chaz, we need to go," I urged, tugging at his sleeve. "This isn't funny anymore. We're not safe." He looked at me, the grin finally fading from his face as reality started to sink in. He nodded, and we began to inch backward, further into the shadows of the cemetery. The gravestones around us loomed like silent sentinels, offering us some small measure of cover as we retreated. We had made it about 20 yards when we heard something that froze both of us in place. A deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "They're still here." The voice was unlike anything I had ever heard, low, booming, and filled with a malice that chilled me to the bone. Chaz and I exchanged a terrified glance, and without another word, we bolted. We ran through the cemetery, dodging between gravestones, our footsteps muffled by the soft earth and overgrown grass. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps as we neared the edge of the cemetery. Just ahead, the fence loomed, separating us from the safety of the park beyond. We needed to get over that fence. Now. Chaz reached it first, scaling it like his life depended on it, because at that moment it did. I followed close behind, my hands trembling as I grabbed the top of the fence and pulled myself over. My foot slipped on the wet grass as I landed, but I didn't stop. We sprinted through the park, heading for the safety of the parking lot where we had left Chaz's car. The entire way, I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind us, or worse, to see those cloaked figures emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the night and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. We reached the car, practically collapsing into the seats as Chaz fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and we sped out of there, the mansion disappearing behind us in the rearview mirror. For a long time, neither of us said anything. We just sat there, the sound of the tires on the road the only noise in the car. Finally, Chaz broke the silence. "You think we stumbled onto a cult or something?" I didn't know how to answer. What we had seen, the pentagram, the cloaked figures, the voice, it all seemed too bizarre to be real, but it had happened, and I had no intention of ever going back to find out more. It was the fall of 2017, during the end of my pledge process, when the fraternity I was rushing had a tradition that involved a trip to an abandoned hospital a few towns over. Each pledge class had to visit the place and explore it as part of some weird initiation rite. Most of us thought it was just a way to freak out the new guys, but we went along with it. I carpooled with a few of my pledge brothers, including Joshua, who I'd been hanging out with a lot lately. There were too many of us to keep track of, so I'll just mention him. We drove out to the hospital late at night, parking in a lot by a big park nearby. It was pitch black, the only light coming from our phone flashlights as we started the walk toward the hospital. We had to cut through a small patch of woods separating the park from the hospital. I instantly regretted wearing my brand new white Air Force Ones, but there was no turning back now. We trudged through the underbrush, the branches scratching at our arms as we made our way to the massive looming building. Seeing the hospital up close was unsettling. The tall, abandoned structure stood completely dark, its windows broken and its walls crumbling with age. It was hard to imagine this place had once been full of life. A couple of the guys knew how to get in. There was a broken window on one of the lower levels that led into the basement. One by one, we climbed through, our feet splashing into a shallow layer of water that coated the floor. Joshua and I stayed at the back of the group, following the others as we ascended the stairs and walked through the creepy, dilapidated hallways. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. The walls were surprisingly free of graffiti, and James, one of the older guys, mentioned that not a lot of people came here since they didn't know the secret ways in. We wandered through the hospital, splitting up into smaller groups as we explored different areas. Joshua and I decided to check out a corridor on the second floor that the others hadn't gone down yet. The rooms we passed were a mix of untouched and trashed. Some still had medical equipment and hospital beds, while others looked like they had been ransacked years ago. We entered one of the rooms, and while we were looking around, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. Someone walked past the door, a black shadow, barely visible in the dim light of our flashlights. "Yo, did you see that?" I whispered to Joshua. He nodded, and we both stepped into the hallway. At the far end, we saw someone standing there, motionless. I couldn't tell if they were facing us or looking at the wall, but it was clear they weren't part of our group. "Who is that?" I called out, but there was no response. Instead, the figure turned and walked into the room next to them, disappearing from view. Joshua and I exchanged a glance. "We should go back to the group," I said, suddenly feeling uneasy. We hurried down the opposite end of the hallway, our footsteps echoing in the silence. We were almost back to where we had last seen the others when it happened. A blood-curdling scream pierced the air, loud enough to send chills down my spine. It was the scream of a woman, filled with pure primal terror, and it came from the direction we had just been. Joshua and I froze, staring at each other in shock. The hallway had fallen completely silent. No footsteps, no voices, just the lingering echo of the scream. We ran, sprinting back toward our friends, shouting for them to go. Panic set in as we reached the lower level, crawling out of the same broken window we had entered through. As I scrambled through, I could hear footsteps behind us, loud, deliberate stomps coming from the stairs. They weren't from anyone in our group. I didn't want to look back. We ran through the woods, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as we made it back to the cars. Only then, when we were safely back on the road, did I allow myself to breathe again. I told everyone about the figure I had seen in the corridor and how the screams had come from that same direction. Nobody had any answers, but one thing was certain. Whatever was in that hospital wasn't just a figment of our imaginations. Something, or someone, was still there, and I had no desire to ever go back and find out who it was.